Hello, everyone. Today we'll be looking at an interview with Justin Steele, president of Google.org, which is Google's data-driven, human-focused philanthropy organization. And if that sounds like ambiguous corporate speak to you, then we're all on the same page. So let's see what the philanthropic arm of the company whose motto is "Don't be evil" is up to.
Racism is alive and, unfortunately, doing really well right now in the United States.
Wait, I remember you. You were at the Lesbians Who Tech conference. Not that it matters or anything, just one of those ain't it a small world moments. But yes, racism is alive and well in America today. I mean, the title of this video is Racial Justice with Google.org. Say it with me. Racial justice. Justice predicated on skin color. When that's the concept you're promoting, don't you need there to be racism in order to justify your cause?
Between hate crimes...
In 2015, there were 5,850 hate crime incidents reported nationwide. 6,000 prosecuted hate crimes in a population of 321 million.
Immigration bans.
The travel ban affects countries, not races. Immigration laws affect people foreign to this country coming to this country. Those laws affect anyone who is not American, regardless of race.
Police killings of black people.
All deaths of black people involving the police are the result of racism. None were justified. None involved a non-white officer in conjunction with the death. I am happy to hear you go over every instance and show racism was the motive, rather than officer or public safety. I'm not saying there have not been unjustified shootings of black people, but just because a black person is shot by the police does not automatically make that shooting one motivated by racism.
And a lack of diversity in tech, racism is prevalent in nearly every aspect of our day-to-day lives.
The lack of diversity in tech. So tech companies are racist. Well, by all means, give us a list of those companies so that they can be prosecuted for violating the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and a dozen other federal laws. I look forward to all of the criminal prosecutions. And I'm sure that the situation at Google completely counters the trends you're citing as racist. Right?
In the 2 months following the election, there were over 1,000 documented instances of bias-related harassment and intimidation toward immigrants, black people, Muslim people, and LGBT people.
1,000 incidents over 2 months of the Trump administration. So, about on par with 2014, which had just under 5,500 hate crimes reported all year, and when the president was black, and before Trump announced his candidacy. Got it.
For example, several mosques and Islamic centers around the country received an identical letter that described Muslims as children of Satan.
And so these 3 handwritten letters, which all then presumably came from one whole person, have been proven to come from a hateful bigot and were not manufactured hoaxes to stir up religious tensions. You know that for a fact.
Meanwhile, there's still a major lack of diversity in the industry and reports of racism and discrimination in the tech workplace.
Again, if those things are happening, then federal laws are being broken. Call the authorities.
Are we at a point where we have to accept that racism is never going to go away?
Well, I don't know. Will there come a time when you can see an office full of people who don't look like you and not see it as an example of racism?
I don't know if you have to accept that it's never going to go away. It's one of those historical problems that we've dealt with for hundreds of years, so it's obviously not going to go away quickly.
Spoiler alert, it's never going to go away completely. Never, ever. But in the West, at least, its legitimacy as a basis for law and public actions has been so torpedoed over the last 150 years that racism is as unpopular a notion than it ever was. A black man was elected to the presidency twice, and Beyoncé isn't rich because white people aren't paying to hear her sing.
Will it ever go away? I don't know. There's always been social identification based on all kinds of different factors. And so I think there's a human tendency to in-group, out-group that we might always see, but I think race can become less prevalent of something that's really determinative.
Just about exactly what I said. That's the best you can hope for. And again, compare today to just 50 years ago, and tell me we're not getting closer and closer to that being the reality.
What are some of the most egregious examples of racial injustice in our society right now?
Well, certainly loss of life, right? I mean, I think the most egregious things you see is when someone loses their life, and partly due to the fact that they've been racially profiled or there's racial bias that exists. So, yeah, certainly the killings that we've seen, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, those types of things are pretty egregious.
And the officer who shot Philando Castile has been charged with 3 felonies, including second-degree manslaughter. It was a legitimate tragedy, and the guilty party is being prosecuted. And the Alton Sterling case is currently under investigation by the Department of Justice. And so what do these 2 incidents tell us? That when a police shooting is suspicious, they are put under legal scrutiny. Having a badge is not a license to kill.
And what about specific to the tech industry?
In terms of kind of like racial bias that we see?
In terms of racial injustice.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we've been clear with this, the numbers in tech have a lot of room for growth. And so we've seen lack of representation, and there's a lot of work that's being done to try to address that, but that's certainly a challenge.
So, is Google racist? Because 59% of its employees are white, and only 2% are black. So, I guess you're working for a racist company, right?
So at Google, and this is across all tech companies, there's a lack of diversity. How hard is it to get Google employees on board with some of the racial justice initiatives that you're doing through google.org?
The work actually wouldn't exist without the sort of enthusiasm and passion of the employees. When we actually started this work, it was largely riding the momentum of particularly the Black Googler Network, which I'm a part of. We had done a hoodie march after Trayvon Martin, and one of the first mass consciousness raising moments inside the company, and that was led by the employees, led by the Black Googler Network.
The Black Googler Network? Huh. Is there a white Googler network by chance? How about an Asian Googler network? And if not, why not? And Trayvon Martin. So you've been at this since at least 2012, and yet with the stats from 2016, like I said, Google is made up of only 2% black employees, same as it was in 2014. So I guess the question is, why has Google been so consistently reluctant to hire black people?
So you mentioned the Black Googlers Network. I'm curious about how to get allies on board and getting allies to support what the Black Googlers Network is doing.
Allies. So I have to assume non-black people? How do you get people of other races to support a racially centric group? I'm very curious.
And there's a great example recently of where that allyship really stepped up. We had hosted a screening of the film 13th, Ava DuVernay's film about mass incarceration. And one of the allies, an Asian American woman at Google, actually came to the 13th screening, was really inspired by it, heard the call to allyship, saw the Every 28 Hours play up here in the Bay Area, a play that really highlights the fact that every 28 hours a black person in America is shot by a police officer or vigilante. And she brought that play to Google a couple weeks ago.
Do you mean that every 28 hours statistic that was shown to be patently false? It's so good to know that the employees at the world's most highly advanced search engine are so skilled at using their own product that they can verify information before relaying it to others or acting upon it themselves.
And what about outside of Google? How do you think we can get more people in the tech community really focused on racial justice?
Well, part of it was what Bryan Stevenson talks about, was just proximity. And oftentimes in our society, if you don't make a conscious effort, you're not going to be proximate to some of these really tough racial issues. Our society is obviously very segregated across lots of different factors, race being one of them.
Race being one of them. How about wealth? How separated are Google employees from other Americans on the basis of wealth and income, do you think?
And so unless you're making a conscious effort to get proximate, you're probably not going to be confronting this. So I think efforts that we can do to really encourage people to get involved in some of the movements, get involved and read and go on your own journey, right? Like Bryan Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. It's like, you know, really you need to go on your own journey, and then you need to really make steps to get more proximate.
So let me see if I can translate all of that. It's not your job to educate others on what you mean or what the problems are. People need to educate themselves, and then they'll be ready to become allies. And this is how you're going to bring outsiders in to support your cause, by putting the onus on them to figure out what your issues are without telling them. Sounds like a bit of a trap, one where you can always hold over the heads of others that they're just not getting it, so you can retain the moral and intellectual high ground. For my viewers, let me know in the comments if that strategy sounds at all similar to any other movements in history.
Right, so is that kind of the advice that you have maybe for people who want to do something about racial justice but aren't really sure where to begin, like read a book?
Yeah, it does sound ridiculous, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. So I think like it's partly, you know, you look at the community organizing framework and you sort of start with the individual, the internal, right? And there's a lot of work that we all have to do internally to check our biases and understand more about the history and the knowledge.
Yes, one must look within to find your inherent sin, I mean your inherent bias, and then you must confess, I mean acknowledge that bias in order to try and purge it from your soul. I mean your attitude. Even though you can't, because it will always be there, because we're all inherently biased. So all you can do is perpetually apologize.
But as you start to move out from there, you start to talk about the interpersonal. Then it's like our relationship amongst each other and how we relate to each other. And then you can start to think about institutions and systems. A lot of times people, especially people in tech, want to jump straight to the systems and the institutions because that's where you can get a lot of leverage change. But I think when something like race, it's really important to start at that internal and interpersonal connectedness before you start to jump and try to change institutions and systems.
Yes. Make sure that you are pure in mind and spirit before attempting to bring the good news to the monolithic centers of all evil, tech companies. Which Google totally is. But evil? Oh, totally not.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, because I mean, a lot of what's going on with racial injustice, it is systemic.
Yeah.
I hear the word systemic used quite a bit these days, and that's something relating to a system. And so, given Google's employment makeup, I would love to know the mechanisms in their system to keep their percentage of black employees at 2% over the past several years. I mean, you must be able to articulate Google's system of oppression, right? There must be a training manual that outlines this system, correct? And so, given that there's a system to this, which obviously violates a whole raft of federal discrimination laws, we're going to get that list of tech companies who are all using identifiable systems of racist hiring practices. Right?
But you think that in order to really affect change, even though it's systemic, we need to still start on the individual
Well, I think it
level.
depends on whether you're talking about what the individual agency is versus an institution. I think what's been really powerful about Google stepping into racial justice's work is that we are a big institution and we can start to work at an institutional level. So if you look at our grant making, very little of it in the racial justice portfolio is actually focused on direct service work in communities of color. It actually is focused a little bit more on how do we change the narrative or paradigm on race that individuals believe through like Bryan Stevenson's work on lynching in America.
Lynching in America. Bryan Stevenson. Okay. What is that, and how is that meant to change individual belief? So, Lynching in America was a report produced by the Equal Justice Initiative, whose director is indeed Bryan Stevenson. It documents some 4,075 cases of lynching that occurred between 1877 and 1950, and it makes the case that these crimes amounted to racial terrorism. Okay, sure, stipulated. And is that it? Convincing people that lynchings were used in the past as a form of racial terror? I think that was pretty well understood, even back then. So, what does this have to do with changing individual beliefs? Are you somehow assuming that people couldn't have understood that concept before? I'm confused. I guess I better go find a book and educate myself.
Or we're targeting the criminal justice system as a whole, so the Center for Policing Equity trying to look at police agencies as an institution, as a system, and looking at use of force and community trust. And
looking at police agencies as an institution? Maybe I'm misunderstanding. Is he meaning to say that they group many different police agencies as all being connected as one institutional entity? Huh. Sounds kind of intersectional.
So as an institution, we're actually pretty focused on the systemic side of it. I think as an individual, I think your first step as an individual needs to be internally. Right. I would really challenge institutions to work at the institutional level.
Individuals should work internally. Institutions need to work at the institutional level. Even though racism is systemic in these institutions, and individuals should not try to create change in these institutions until they have educated themselves on the specific problems. Problems that you're keeping mysterious and nebulous, so that there's always room to claim you know better than any ally what the issues are. Oh, and also, lynchings are bad. Got it.
What do you think needs to happen next in order to advance racial justice?
I think a lot of it is about knowledge, right? And people's general sort of awareness of the topics.
By reading books you recommend, right?
The myth of racial difference took 200 years, right, to sort of build up. And I think it's something that's very deeply ingrained. And so if we're going to start to debunk that and eliminate things like mass incarceration that arise out of that myth.
So mass incarceration rises out of a myth of racial difference. People in jail aren't in jail because they've committed a crime, so that's the real myth? And the truth is that they're there because of the myth of racial difference. Nope, don't got it.
We're really going to need to educate ourselves. So again, going back to really starting at the internal level and going on your own journey to really understand the history and how we got here and where some of that bias comes from. And a lot of the implicit bias research that starts to make you aware of how your unconscious can really inform the topic in a negative way.
How our unconscious can inform in a negative way. So this happens while we're asleep and not awake? Well, that's a relief. Unless you meant subconscious. I have never understood why they always say unconscious bias. It makes zero sense. But regardless, it's just a euphemism for racism. Racism that is subconscious and thus not visible or necessarily explicitly evident, but is still informing your decisions and opinions, whether you admit to it or not. And not admitting to it, of course, only tends to show just how deeply racism runs within you. You must acknowledge your original sin if you ever hope to try and perpetually atone for it.
That makes sense.
That makes sense. Does it? Well, I guess if you say so. Because you see, believing that our society today is so subversively, endemically, and rabidly racist as you imply, really is a matter of faith. And so I wonder when Google will cure itself of its obvious institutional and systemic racism, and show the world how it ought to be done. Because I have to believe that it's just around the corner. As always, thank you for watching.